started in the dead of night. No warning, no declaration of war, no drums from an approaching enemy, just darkness. And then suddenly the kingdom of Orama was on fire. The palace guards at the eastern gate were the first to fall. They didn't even have time to raise an alarm. The men who cut them down were not strangers. They were soldiers of Orama itself, men who had eaten at the same fire, trained on the same ground, sworn the same oath to protect the very throne they were now marching against. They moved through the palace corridors with the kind of precision that only comes from knowing exactly where every guard post was, exactly when every rotation happened, exactly which path led directly to the king's chamber. This had been planned for a long time. By the time King Adafo was shaken awake by his personal guard, the sound of clashing iron was already inside the palace walls. He sat up, and in the few seconds it took him to understand what was happening. His world had already changed forever. His guard was speaking fast, telling him the eastern and northern gates had been breached, that the attackers were their own men, that the royal quarters were being swept one by one. Then came the sound that broke the king where he stood. A scream from his son's chamber, short, sudden, then silence. King Adafo knew that silence. He had been a warrior long before he was a king. That was the silence of a life ending. He didn't move toward the chamber. He couldn't, because in that moment he understood with a horrible clarity exactly what was happening and exactly who was behind it. And he knew that if he went toward his son, he would never reach his daughter. He made the hardest decision a father can make. He turned away from his son's chamber and ran toward Amara's. She was already awake when he burst through the door, her eyes wide, her body rigid with the kind of fear that comes before understanding. The king crossed the room in seconds. He grabbed her by both arms and looked at her the way a man looks at something he is about to lose. He didn't waste time explaining. There was no time. He pulled a sealed message from inside his robe, already prepared, already bound with the royal mark of Orama, and pressed it into her hands. He told her it had to reach the kingdom of Zawari in the west. He told her to trust no one on the road. He told her that the king of Zawari would know what to do when he saw the seal. Amara stared at him. "Father, go." His voice didn't shake. "Don't stop. Don't look back, go." Two of his most trusted personal guards appeared at the door. The king handed his daughter to them with his eyes, not his words. They understood. They grabbed Amara and moved. The last thing she saw before they pulled her through the back passage of the palace was her father turning to face the corridor, where the sound of boots was already getting louder. She never saw him again. They moved through the back passages of the palace that most people didn't know existed. The guards knew every turn. They had walked these paths 1,000 times in daylight. Now they ran them in darkness with torches coming up behind them and the sounds of the palace growing louder with every step. They got Amara out through the southern wall, through a passage that opened into the bush just beyond the palace grounds. One guard went first, checking the darkness. Then Amara. Then the second guard pulling the passage closed behind them. They ran. Through the bush, through the tall grass, away from the fire and the noise and everything that had been her life until 20 minutes ago. Amara ran with the sealed message clutched against her chest, her feet finding the ground in the darkness, her breath coming hard and fast. They had been running for nearly an hour when the second guard suddenly grabbed her arm and pulled her down into the grass. She heard it a second later, voices and the sound of men moving through the bush ahead of them. Dacan's men were already outside the palace, already covering the escape routes. The first guard signaled. They changed direction, cutting east through denser bush, pushing deeper into the darkness to avoid the search. For another hour they moved this way, stopping, listening, changing course, avoiding the sounds of men hunting through the night. Then an arrow came out of the darkness, caught the first guard in the shoulder. He went down without a sound, hitting the ground hard. The second guard spun around, sword already drawn, putting himself between Amara and the direction the arrow had come from. 3 men emerged from the bush ahead, armed, moving fast, closing the distance. The guard fought. He was good, but he was 1 man against 3 and he had been running for 2 hours. "Run," he told Amara without looking at her. "Run and don't stop." She ran. Behind her she heard the sound of the fight. Iron against iron, a grunt, a crash of bodies through undergrowth. Then nothing. She ran alone through the darkness of the bush, the sealed message still pressed against her chest. The kingdom she had grown up in burning somewhere behind her. But how did it come to this? To understand that, we have to go back months before this night. Chief Dacan had sat in King Adafo's council for 11 years. He was respected, well-spoken, the kind of man who always had the right words at the right moment, in council meetings, in public gatherings, in private conversations with other chiefs. People listened when he spoke. The king himself had once called him one of the sharpest minds in Orama. That was exactly what made him dangerous, because beneath that respected face, behind those careful words, lived a man who had decided long ago that he deserved more than a seat at the king's table. He wanted the table. He wanted the throne above it. He had watched King Adafo lead Orama for years, and with every passing season the resentment inside him grew heavier and darker until it stopped being resentment and became something else entirely. It became a plan. The problem was simple. King Adafo was loved. By his people, by his warriors, by the chiefs who sat alongside Dacan in council. A direct move against the throne would unite the entire kingdom against him before he could consolidate any power. He needed something else. He needed someone on the inside. Someone close enough to the king that when the move came, it would be over before anyone could respond. He needed General Kofi Bra. The first conversation happened at night, in Dacan's private quarters, with no witnesses. Dacan had been careful about how he approached it. He didn't come straight to the point. That was not how a man like Dacan operated. He spent weeks before that night planting small seeds in Kofi Bra's mind. Quiet observations about how the general's contributions were never fully recognized. How a man of his military skill deserved more than he was given. How the kingdom's direction under Adafo was leading Orama toward weakness, not strength. He watered those seeds patiently, and General Kofi Bra, a proud man, a brilliant soldier, a man who had spent his entire life serving a throne that had never once asked him what he truly wanted, found himself listening more carefully than he should have. The night Dacan finally spoke plainly, Kofi Bra sat across from him in silence for a long time after the words were out. Then he asked what Dacan needed from him. What followed happened slowly and quietly over the next several months. Kofi Bra began making small adjustments, rotating certain guards away from key positions, replacing them with men loyal to Dacan without anyone noticing the pattern. He identified the palace's blind spots and made sure they stayed blind. He fed Dacan information about the king's schedule, his movements, the layout of the royal quarters at night. Every piece of it looked like normal military administration from the outside. Nobody saw it coming. Not the other generals. Not the other chiefs. Not King Adafo himself, who trusted Kofi Bra so completely that the general had access to parts of the palace that even senior advisors couldn't enter. That trust became the knife. On the night Dacan finally moved, Kofi Bra made sure the right gates were open, the right guards were absent, and the right men were in position. He had handed Dacan the kingdom on a path cleared of every obstacle. And then he stood back and watched it burn. Now Amara was alone in the bush, running west, hunted, carrying a message she hadn't read and a hope she wasn't sure she still had. Behind her, Orama was in Dacan's hands. Ahead of her was a journey through strange lands, hostile borders, and Dacan had sworn to bring her back before she reached Zawari. She didn't know it yet, but somewhere ahead of her on that same western road, a man was walking alone. Zoranu had been walking for 3 days straight before he made camp that night. He chose a spot deep inside the forest, far from any road or village path. Not because he was hiding, a man his size never truly hides, but because he had learned a long time ago that the further he stayed from people, the simpler his life became. He built a small fire, ate what little he had, and lay down on the ground with his back against a tree trunk and his eyes on the stars showing through the gaps in the canopy above him. He was almost asleep when he heard it. A woman's scream, distant but sharp, cutting through the forest silence like a blade. Zoranu was on his feet before the sound finished. He moved through the trees fast, following the direction of the scream, pushing through undergrowth without slowing. The forest was dark, but he had always moved well in darkness. Another scream, closer now, and he could hear voices underneath it. Men's voices, rough and impatient. He broke through a line of trees and saw them. 6 warriors standing in a small clearing. Big men, armed and confident the way men are when they know nobody is coming for them. One of them had a young woman thrown over his shoulder like a sack of grain, her fists beating against his back as she twisted and fought and screamed. The others stood around laughing, unbothered by her struggling. Zoranu stepped into the clearing. "Put her down," he said. The laughter stopped. 6 heads turned toward him. The man carrying the woman didn't put her down. He shifted her weight on his shoulder and looked Zoranu over slowly, the way men do when they are measuring someone they have already decided is not a threat. He said something to the others and they laughed again. Then 2 of them came at Zoranu with their swords drawn. The first one swung hard at his neck. Zoranu didn't step back. He caught the man's sword arm mid-swing with one hand, stopped it dead, and drove his elbow into the warrior's chest with a force that lifted him off the ground and sent him crashing back into the tree line. The second warrior's blade connected with Zoranu's side, and the iron bounced off like it had struck solid rock. The warrior stared at his own sword for half a second, confused. Zoranu grabbed him by the front of his chest and threw him sideways into 2 of the others, scattering all 3 of them to the ground like they weighed nothing. The 5th warrior charged from behind with a spear aimed at Zoranu's back. The spear hit. It snapped in half on impact. Zoranu turned around, took the broken shaft from the man's frozen hands, and tossed it aside. Then he hit him once, open palm to the chest, and the warrior flew backward and didn't get up. The man still holding Amara on his shoulder had stopped moving entirely. He was watching all of this with wide eyes, his confidence having left him somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd of his men hitting the ground. He looked at Zoranu. He looked at what remained of his unit scattered across the clearing floor. He put the woman down. Then he ran. Amara landed on her feet, breathing hard, her eyes going immediately to the stranger standing in the middle of the clearing surrounded by unconscious men. She looked at him the way someone looks at something they cannot fully explain. Zoranu looked back at her. "Can you walk?" he asked. She straightened herself. "Yes." "Then we should move. There will be more." He was right. They had barely put a mile between themselves and the clearing when they heard movement behind them in the trees. More men, spreading out, covering ground. Zoranu kept them moving without stopping to explain why, cutting through the forest along paths that seemed random but weren't. He was reading the land the way a man reads a familiar face, feeling for direction in the darkness. By the time he finally slowed down, they had put enough distance between themselves and the search that the sounds behind them had faded completely. He found them a spot, a dense cluster of trees on elevated ground where they could see the forest below in both directions, and stopped. They sat in silence for a moment, both of them catching their breath. Amara looked at her hands. They were shaking slightly. She pressed them flat against her thighs and made them stop. Then she looked at the man sitting across from her. He was staring out into the dark forest below, relaxed, unbothered, like the last hour had been a mild inconvenience. She asked him who he was. He told her his name was Zoranu, nothing else. She asked where he came from. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Far from here." And the way he said it made clear that was all he intended to offer. But Amara had grown up in a court full of men who spoke carefully and meant something different underneath their words. She heard what lived beneath his. This was not a man who had simply traveled far. This was a man who had left something behind and sealed the door after him. 3 months before that night, Zoranu had been sitting outside his home in the village of Okara when the elders came for him. Not with weapons. They had learned long ago that weapons were useless against him. They came with words instead, which had always been the sharper tool when used against a man who still wanted to belong somewhere. They told him he had to go. It hadn't started with the elders. It had started years before that, from the moment people in Okara began to notice that Zoranu was not like other men. Not in the way that earns admiration, in the way that earns fear. The things his body could do defied every understanding they had. Iron bent against his skin. He could move weight that 10 men together couldn't shift. In his younger years, people had celebrated it. A strong son of Okera, a protector, someone to be proud of. But pride has a short memory when fear moves in. The stories began slowly. A trader passing through who swore Zoranu had stopped a charging bull with one hand. A group of young men who had tried to test him one night and wouldn't speak about what happened afterward. A wall that had collapsed during construction that Zoranu had held up alone with his back while the workers scrambled out from under it, and then set down gently when they were clear. That last one was the one that truly broke something in people's minds, because there was no framework for it. No story they had ever been told that explained a man like this. And what people cannot explain, they eventually decide to fear. Someone began whispering that his strength wasn't natural, that it came from something dark, that a man the gods had not made this way must have made a terrible bargain somewhere to become what he was. The whispers spread the way whispers always do, quietly at first, then everywhere at once, until they became the thing people believed without remembering they had ever doubted it. One man in particular pushed hardest. His name was Gamu, a senior elder, respected, with the kind of influence in Okera that turned his opinions into community decisions. He had feared Zoranu since the beginning but had been smart enough to wait until the fear was shared widely enough before he acted on it. When he finally moved against Zoranu, he didn't do it openly. He did it through others. Quiet conversations, planted doubts, small suggestions that grew into collective decisions. By the time Zoranu understood what was happening, it was already done. The people he had grown up with, the people he had protected, whose walls he had held up, whose children he had pulled from rivers and burning huts. Those same people stood before him now with cold faces and told him he was no longer welcome in Okera. He looked at them for a long time. He didn't fight it, not because he couldn't. Every man standing there knew what fighting it would have looked like, and it was the reason none of them had come with weapons. But Zoranu had never used his strength to take anything, only to protect. And he was not going to start now, not even for himself. He packed what he owned, which wasn't much, and he walked west, away from Okera, away from everything that had ever known his name. He had been walking ever since, with no particular destination and no particular plan, just moving, the way a man moves when he is trying to put enough distance between himself and a disappointment too heavy to carry standing still. Back in the forest above Orama's eastern border, Amara watched the stranger's face as he stared out into the darkness. She didn't know any of that. She didn't know Okera or Gamu or what it had cost him to walk away from the only home he had ever had. All she knew was that this man had walked into a clearing of 6 armed warriors and walked back out without a single mark on him. She opened her mouth to ask him something else, then stopped herself, because she had her own things she wasn't ready to speak about yet. The sealed message pressed against her body, her father's face in that last moment. The sound she had heard from her brother's chamber that she was already trying very hard not to think about. She looked west through the trees instead. Somewhere out there, past borders and rivers and kingdoms she had never seen, was Zawari. And a message that had to get there. "I need to reach the kingdom of Zawari," she said quietly, not asking him, just saying it out loud, the way a person speaks when they are reminding themselves of the only thing still keeping them moving. Zoranu said nothing for a moment. Then he stood up, looked at the western sky and started walking. "I know a path," he said without turning around. Amara looked at his back for a second. Then she got up and followed. The journey west had begun. They traveled by night and rested by day. It was Zoranu's decision, and he didn't explain it. He simply shifted their movement to the dark hours and found them cover before sunrise. Dense bush, dry riverbeds, anywhere that put them out of sight before the world woke up. Amara didn't argue. She had seen enough in the clearing to understand that this man's instincts were worth following without a debate. They didn't talk much. Zoranu was not a man who filled silence with words, and Amara had too much pressing behind her eyes to make conversation. They moved. They stopped. They moved again. The western road stretched ahead of them through forest and open grassland and the kind of ancient bush that looked the same in every direction if you didn't know how to read it. Zoranu knew how to read it. By the third night, they had crossed out of Orama's territory entirely and were pushing through the borderlands between kingdoms. a stretch of wild land that belonged to no one and was therefore watched by everyone. Zoranu chose a camp spot at the edge of a tree line overlooking the border village of Kambesa, far enough from the village to avoid attention but close enough to use its paths at first light. He told Amara to sleep. She tried. She was exhausted enough that sleep came faster than she expected, her body overruling her mind for a few hours. Zoranu sat with his back against a tree and watched the darkness. He was still watching when the grass moved. Not from wind. The night was still. This was something pushing through the undergrowth from the east, moving carefully, trying not to make sound, but moving in too many places at once for it to be an animal. Zoranu was on his feet before the first one broke cover. They came out of the bush from 3 directions at once. 8 of them, big men in dark cloth, heavy swords already drawn, moving fast and fanning out to surround the camp before their targets could run. It was a well-practiced formation, the kind that worked on people who didn't know it was coming. Zoranu was already moving before they completed it. He went straight at the 3 coming from the east, the largest group, covering the ground between them in seconds. The first warrior swung a heavy blade at his head. Zoranu ducked under it, grabbed the man by his sword arm and his belt, lifted him completely off the ground and drove him into the 2 men behind him. All 3 went down in a crash of iron and bodies. 2 from the left flank reached him simultaneously, attacking from both sides. The blade on his left connected with his ribs and snapped. The warrior holding it stumbled backward from the impact, like he had swung into a boulder. The one on the right drove a spear at Zoranu's chest with both hands behind it. The spear tip crumpled on contact. Zoranu grabbed the shaft, pulled the warrior forward by it, and headbutted him once. The man dropped without a sound. Amara was awake now, on her feet, pressing her back against the tree. The remaining 3 assassins had stopped their advance. They stood in a loose line looking at what had just happened to 5 of their number in less than a minute. One of them looked at his own sword. Then he looked at Zoranu standing in the middle of the camp, breathing normally like he had just done something mildly inconvenient. 2 of them ran. The third, the one who had been sent to lead this unit, a broad-shouldered man with a long scar across his jaw, didn't run. He reached into his cloth and pulled out a short knife, throwing it at Zoranu's throat with practiced precision. It bounced off and landed in the dirt. He ran. Zoranu watched them go. Then he turned and looked at Amara. She was staring at him with an expression he had seen before, the look people get when they have witnessed something their mind is still trying to catch up to. "We move now," he said. "They will bring more." They left the camp and pushed on through the rest of the night. By the following evening, Dacan's reach had already stretched further west than either of them knew. Back in Orama, now under Dacan's full control, the chief sat in the throne room that he had wanted for 11 years and listened to the report from his surviving assassin with a face that showed nothing. 6 men sent. 1 returned. The princess was alive and moving west with a man who could not be cut by iron. Dacan was quiet for a long moment. Then he called for his messengers. By the next morning, notices had been dispatched to every village, every border post, every market and river crossing between Orama and the Western Kingdoms. The message was simple, a description of a young woman of royal bearing traveling with a large man of unusual strength. Any person who brought information on their location would be rewarded beyond what most people in those villages earned in a year. Any person who captured the woman alive would be given land and a senior position in the new kingdom of Orama. The bounty spread faster than they were walking. They reached the Obari River on the 4th night. It was wide, too wide to swim comfortably in darkness, and the only crossing point for 2 days in either direction was a shallow ford that the Western traders used when the rains were low. Zoranu had known about it. What he hadn't known was that someone had gotten there first. He stopped at the tree line before the riverbank and stood still for a moment, studying the far side. Amara almost walked into his back. She stopped and followed his eyes across the water. The far bank looked empty, quiet, just trees and shadow and the sound of the river moving over its stones. Then she saw it, the faintest shift of movement high in the trees on the opposite bank. Then another, then a third further downstream. Archers positioned and waiting. Zoranu scanned the crossing for a long time without speaking. Then he turned and moved back into the tree line, heading downstream along their side of the bank. Amara followed. They walked for nearly 20 minutes before he stopped again at a point where the river bent sharply and the water ran deeper but narrower, compressed between two rocky banks. No trees on the far side tall enough to post archers in. He looked at the crossing. Then he looked at Amara. "Can you hold your breath?" he asked. She looked at the dark water. It was moving fast through the narrow channel. She looked back at him. "Yes," she said. "Stay close to me and stay low in the water." He went in first, feeling the current, planting his feet against the riverbed as the water pushed hard against him. Amara followed, gasping once at the cold, grabbing onto his arm as the current tried to pull her sideways. He moved slowly and steadily across, his body cutting the current for her, keeping them both anchored against the pull of the river. An arrow hit the water 2 feet to Amara's left. They had been spotted. Shouts erupted from upstream where the main ford was, the archers breaking position and moving along the bank to get a clear shot at the crossing point. More arrows hit the water around them, getting closer as the archers found their range in the dark. Zoranu pushed faster. The water was chest deep at the center and the current was fighting him hard, but he moved through it like it was shallow. He kept his body between Amara and the upstream bank where the arrows were coming from. One hit him in the shoulder. It snapped on impact. He didn't slow down. They hit the far bank and Zoranu pulled Amara up onto the rocks in one motion, not stopping, moving immediately into the tree line on the western side before the archers could reposition. They pushed through the trees fast and didn't slow down for an hour. When they finally stopped, Amara sat on the ground and pressed her hands against her knees and breathed. She looked up at the broken arrow shaft still lodged against Zoranu's shoulder. The tip bent sideways where it had failed to penetrate. He reached up and pulled it out the way a person removes a thorn. He looked at it briefly and dropped it. She shook her head slowly. He said nothing. The village of Asante sat 2 days west of the Obari crossing, a small but busy trading stop where multiple western routes converged. They needed to pass through it. The paths around it would cost them 3 extra days and their food supply was running low. Zoranu didn't like it. He said so without elaborating. But they had no choice. They entered Asante in the late afternoon when the market was still active and movement through the village was heavy enough that 2 more travelers wouldn't draw immediate attention. Zoranu pulled the cloth of his outer garment up around his face and kept his head down. Amara did the same. They moved quickly to the trader's quarter, got what they needed, dried meat, grain, water skins, and turned to leave. What they didn't see was the village elder's son at the back of the market, studying them over the heads of the crowd with narrow eyes. He had heard the bounty notice 2 days before. He had heard the description: a young woman of bearing, a large man of extraordinary strength. He looked at the size of the man at the front of the pair and something in his mind clicked into place. He slipped away from the market quietly. They were 20 minutes outside the village on the western road when the attack came. Not from behind, from ahead. 12 men stepping out of the bush on both sides of the road simultaneously, blades drawn, forming a wall across the path. The village elder's son had sent a fast rider ahead to the next waypost where Dacan's men had been stationed since the bounty went out. Zoranu stopped walking. He looked at the 12 men spread across the road ahead of them. Then he handed Amara the supply bundle without looking at her. "Stay behind me," he said. He walked forward. The first 4 came at him together, a coordinated rush from different angles, the way trained men attack when they know a single approach won't work. Zoranu took the hit from the left, let the sword glance off his arm, grabbed that warrior by the throat and used him as a shield against the blade coming from the right. The third man's spear caught him in the chest and bent. The fourth went for his legs with a low sweep. Zoranu stepped over it, came down on the man's sword arm with his heel and pinned it to the ground. He moved through the rest of them like weather, not fast in a way the eye could barely follow, but steady and inevitable the way a flood moves. Each man who hit him discovered what every man before him had discovered. And each man who discovered it responded the same way, with the specific kind of panic that comes from realizing the thing you are fighting cannot be hurt. Inside 4 minutes, all 12 were down or gone. Zoranu stood in the road breathing steadily. He turned back to Amara. She was standing where he had left her, the supply bundle in her hands, watching him. He took the bundle back from her and kept walking west. She fell into step behind him. 3 days later, they reached the city of Adara. It was the largest settlement they had encountered since leaving Orama. A proper ancient city with wide market streets, a permanent population, and enough movement through its center that passing through unnoticed seemed possible. They needed to cross through Adara to access the western road on the other side. Going around it meant adding 4 days to a journey that was already pushing their limits. The city was loud and crowded in the way that only old trading cities are. Packed streets, vendors calling from both sides, animals, carts, people moving in every direction at once. Zoranu and Amara joined the flow of people entering through the eastern gate and pushed into the press of the crowd. It was immediately overwhelming. The streets of Adara's market quarter were narrow and dense, people packed shoulder to shoulder moving in both directions, the noise rising off the crowd like heat. Zoranu moved to the front, his size naturally creating space ahead of them. He reached back and took Amara's hand, pulling her behind him through the crowd, keeping her close as the press of bodies tightened around them. They pushed through the worst of it for nearly 20 minutes, Zoranu's broad shoulders parting the crowd ahead. Amara's hand locked in his as they moved through the noise and heat of the city streets. Then they were through. The crowd thinned ahead of them as the market quarter gave way to the quieter western streets. Zoranu exhaled and turned around. The hand he was holding belonged to a different woman. She was young, confused-looking, staring up at him with wide eyes, clearly as surprised as he was. He released her hand immediately and spun around, looking back into the crowd behind them. Amara was gone. He stood completely still for 2 full seconds. Then he went back into the crowd. He moved fast now, pushing against the flow of people, scanning faces, scanning the street ahead and behind and the side alleys branching off the main market road. The crowd was thick enough that a person could be moved through it without anyone around them noticing. He understood that now. Someone had been in that crowd specifically for this. They had waited for the narrowest, most densely packed section, and they had made the swap there, pulling Amara sideways out of his grip and replacing her with another woman in the same motion. Fast enough and clean enough that he hadn't felt the difference until it was too late. He had been outwitted. The understanding of it sat cold in his chest as he pushed through the crowd asking questions. Grabbing traders, stopping people moving through the market, describing what Amara was wearing, which direction, how long ago. Most people shook their heads. One woman, an older cloth seller whose stall sat at the junction of 2 market streets, had seen something. A group of men moving fast through the crowd with a young woman between them, her head down, moving toward the northern gate. Zoranu was already running before the woman finished speaking. He hit the northern gate at speed and came out onto the road beyond the city wall. Ahead of him, the road stretched north through open grassland, and in the distance, maybe half a mile out, a group of men on foot moving fast with a figure between them. He ran. Not jogging, not the careful measured pace of someone conserving energy. He opened up completely, covering ground the way very few men can, eating up the distance between himself and the group ahead with a speed that had nothing ordinary about it. They heard him coming before they saw him. The group stopped and turned. 8 men, Dacan's personal unit, the ones trusted with the most important task, formed up around Amara with swords out. They had been told about the man. They had heard the reports from the border of Kambesa, from the Obari crossing, from the road outside Asante. They knew what was coming. Knowing didn't help them. Zoranu hit the group like a stone hitting water. He went through the outer ring of men first, 2 on each side, dealt with in the time it takes to breathe twice. The ones in the middle had Amara between them, using her as the reason he couldn't simply come straight through. He adjusted, going low, coming up under the sword line, taking the blade meant for his neck across the top of his head where it rang off his skull and left the warrior holding a vibrating sword arm and a stunned expression. The last man standing put a blade to Amara's throat. Zoranu stopped. They looked at each other across the few feet between them. The man's hand was shaking slightly. His blade was steady, but his eyes weren't. He had run out of colleagues, and he knew it. Zoranu took 1 slow step forward. The man flinched. In that flinch, that single half-second of the blade moving fractionally away from Amara's throat, she drove her elbow hard into the man's ribs, twisted sideways out of his grip, and put herself behind Zoranu in one fast movement. Zoranu closed the remaining distance. The last man went down. He turned to Amara. She was breathing hard, her jaw set, her eyes dry. She looked at him for a moment and then threw her both hands under his arms, hugging him tightly. He said nothing while she sobbed. They walked back to Adara's western gate, collected their supplies from where they had left them, and took the road west out of the city without stopping. They were 2 days from the border of Zawari when Dacan's final message reached his last remaining unit. It was his most senior commander, a man called Oben who had served Dacan since before the coup, who had personally trained the assassination units that had been sent after the princess one after another. Oben had been holding position at a river junction west of Adara with 30 men, waiting for either a success report from the Adara unit or exactly the kind of news he had just received. He read the message. 30 men with the best weapons Dacan's treasury could supply, positioned between the princess and the Zawari border. It was the last move Dacan had. Zoranu and Amara came around a bend in the western road the following morning and walked straight into them. 30 men spread across the road and into the bush on both sides, blocking every direction. Oben stood at the center, the only one not holding a weapon yet, studying the pair who had stopped on the road ahead of him. He looked at Zoranu for a long moment. Then he looked at his 30 men. Then back at Zoranu. Something moved across his face. Not quite fear, but the closest thing to it that a man like Oben allowed himself to feel. He had heard everything. Every report, every failed unit, every broken sword and bent spear tip. He had assembled 30 men because he believed in numbers even when he had stopped believing in iron. "Take them," he said. They came all at once. What followed on that road was something that none of the men who survived it could ever describe properly afterward. Not because they didn't remember it, but because the words didn't exist for what they had seen. A man standing in the middle of 30 armed warriors, taking everything they had and giving it back in ways that left the road looking like a storm had passed through it. Zoranu fought with everything he had held back across every encounter since the clearing where he had first found Amara. The exhaustion of the journey, the cold nights, the river crossing, the crowded city, none of it showed. He moved through Oben's 30 men the way he had moved through every group before them, but bigger now, and with the particular focus of a man who could see the end of something and wanted to reach it. Oben himself came last. He was good, genuinely, exceptionally good in a way that none of the others had been. He didn't swing wildly or rush in. He moved carefully, reading Zoranu, waiting for the opening that had to be there somewhere in a man who had just fought 30 people. He found a moment, or thought he did, and drove his sword in a precise thrust at Zoranu's side. The blade held for a second longer than any other blade had. Then it bent. Oben stared at it. Zoranu hit him once, flat-handed, in the center of his chest. Oben sat down hard in the road and didn't get back up. The few men still standing looked at each other. Then they looked at the road behind them, the long clear road running west towards Zawari's border, which was now completely undefended. They walked away. Zoranu stood in the road until they were gone. Then he turned to Amara, who had watched the whole thing from the road's edge, the sealed message pressed against her chest, the way she had held it since the night her father put it in her hands. He looked at her. She looked at him. Then he turned and started walking west. She walked beside him this time, not behind. The border of Zawari appeared on the horizon before sundown. They crossed into Zawari at sundown. The border was marked by 2 large carved stone pillars standing on either side of the western road, old enough that the inscriptions on them had been worn smooth by decades of wind and rain. Zoranu and Amara passed between them without stopping and kept walking as the last light of the day faded behind the hills to the west. Zawari's border guards found them before they found the guards. For soldiers stepped out of the roadside brush with spears raised. Standard border patrol, cautious and professional. They looked at the pair on the road. A young woman in travel-worn clothing carrying something pressed against her chest. A large man beside her with the kind of stillness about him that experienced soldiers learn to read carefully. Amara spoke before anyone else could. She gave her name, her father's name, the Kingdom of Orama, and she held up the sealed message with King Adafo's royal mark facing outward. The lead guard looked at the seal for a long moment. Then he looked at his men. Then he lowered his spear and told them to follow him. The court of Zawari received them in the great hall that same night. The king of Zawari, a broad, gray-haired man named Oba Sekiru who had ruled his kingdom for over 30 years, sat on his throne and studied the two figures brought before him. His senior advisors stood on both sides of the hall. His sons stood to his right. The room was quiet the way important rooms go quiet when something significant is about to happen. Amara stepped forward and presented the sealed message. A court attendant carried it to the king. Oba Sekiru looked at the seal, at the royal mark of Orama pressed into it, and something shifted in his expression. He had known King Adafo for decades. He recognized that mark the way a man recognizes an old friend's handwriting. He broke the seal and read. The hall stayed silent for a long time after he finished. Then he read it again, slower this time, and when he looked up from the message his eyes went straight to Amara and stayed there with an expression that mixed grief and something else. Something that looked like a decision being made in real time. He spoke to his advisors in a low voice. They leaned in, listened, exchanged brief words among themselves. Then one by one they nodded. Oba Sekiru looked at Amara. He told her that her father had written the message 3 months before the coup. That King Adafo had seen something building in his council. A tension, a darkness he couldn't fully name yet, and had written to his oldest ally in the West to formalize what had long been discussed between them. The message contained a formal agreement, signed with the royal seal of Orama, approving the union between Princess Amara and Oba Sekiru's second son, a young man named Khalad who stood to the king's right and had been listening to all of this with a carefully composed face. King Adafo had written it knowing something might be coming. He had sent his daughter west carrying the document that would save her kingdom, without telling her what she was carrying. Because if she had known, and if she had been caught, that knowledge could have been used against her. Amara stood in the great hall of Zawari and heard all of this and didn't speak for a long moment. She looked down at her hands, the hands that had held that sealed message against her chest for the entire journey, through the bush and the river and the crowded city streets and every dark night in between. Her father had planned this, right to the end. Even in the final hours of his kingdom falling around him, he had been thinking 3 steps ahead, the way he had always been. She pressed her lips together, held everything in. Then she raised her head and told Oba Sekiru that she accepted. The marriage took place 4 days later. It was not an elaborate ceremony. There was no time and Amara was in no condition for celebration. It was formal, witnessed by the king's court and Zawari's senior chiefs, conducted with the weight of a political alliance rather than the lightness of a celebration. Amara stood beside Khalad and spoke the words required of her and received the words required of him, and when it was done the alliance between Orama and Zawari was sealed in the oldest way that kingdoms had always sealed the things that mattered most. Through it all Zoranu stood at the back of the hall and watched. He had been given quarters, food, clothing, the hospitality of a king's court extended to a man who had delivered the princess safely across half a continent. He had accepted what he needed and left the rest. He didn't belong in throne rooms. He had known that his whole life. The morning after the marriage ceremony, he went looking for Amara to tell her he was leaving. He found her in the courtyard before he could say anything. She had seen it in his face the moment he walked through the doorway. The look of a man who has finished something and is already thinking about what comes next. She had been around enough warriors to read it. She went down on her knees before he could speak. Stopped him completely. A queen or the woman who would be queen. Kneeling on the stone floor of a foreign courtyard, looking up at him with an expression that had nothing performative about it. Just genuine, undecorated desperation. She told him she had no one. That every person who had stood beside her before him was gone. That she didn't trust easily and she didn't know how to start again from nothing without someone beside her whose judgment she had seen tested and proven across 100 miles of dangerous road. She asked him to come back with her. To Orama. Zoranu looked at her for a long time. Then he told her to get up off the floor. Zawari's army was formidable. 3,000 soldiers marching east under Oba Sekiru's banner. with Kalad commanding the force and Amara riding at the front of the column. Zoranu walked. He had been offered a horse 3 times and declined 3 times without explaining why. He simply walked at the pace of the army and covered the ground the same way he covered everything. Steadily, without complaint, without apparent effort. Word of the army's approach reached Orama 2 days before they did. Dacan received the news in the throne room, King Adafo's throne room, where he had been sitting for weeks with the particular restless energy of a man who has taken something he wanted and discovered that having it feels nothing like he expected. He had known this was possible. He had sent everything he had to stop the princess reaching Zawari, and every unit had failed. He had understood for days that this moment was coming. He called his warriors together. What remained of them? It was not enough. It had never going to be enough against Zawari's force, not even if every one of his units had returned from the Western Road intact. Dacan had been powerful enough to take a throne by treachery. He had never been powerful enough to hold it against a real army. Zawari's soldiers entered Orama from the Eastern Road at dawn. Dacan's forces held for less than 2 hours. They were outnumbered, out-organized, and fighting men who had something Dacan's warriors fundamentally lacked. A reason to be there that went beyond a chief's ambition. Orama's own people, those who had survived the coup and lived under Dacan's rule since, began opening gates and clearing paths as the Zawari army advanced. The kingdom itself was rejecting him. By mid-morning it was over. Dacan was found in the throne room. He had not run, whether from pride or from the knowledge that there was nowhere to run to that would be far enough. He was surrounded and brought out into the palace courtyard where Amara was waiting. General Kofi Bra was brought out beside him in chains. The man who had spent years eating at King Adafo's table, sleeping under his protection, commanding his armies, now stood in the sunlight of the courtyard with his hands bound and his eyes on the ground. Amara looked at both of them. She didn't speak for a long time. She looked at Dacan, at the man who had sat in her father's council for 11 years and smiled in his face while building the machinery that would destroy him. Then she looked at Kofi Bra, whose betrayal had made all of it possible, who had handed the inside of the palace to Dacan like a gift wrapped in loyalty. Under Orama's law, the judgment for treason was clear. It had always been clear. It did not require a long deliberation or an elaborate trial. The confession was enough, and both men confessed completely when the alternative was considered. Dacan named every chief who had known. Kofi Bra named every soldier who had participated. The full picture of the conspiracy came out in the courtyard that morning, every name and every role, as each man tried to make his accounting complete. It didn't change the judgment, but it gave Amara the names she needed. The other conspiring chiefs were found, one after another, through the confessions of those who came before them. None of them escaped. The net that had been cast in that courtyard caught every person who had stood beside Dacan in the dark and called it ambition. Orama's law was carried out before sundown. After it was done, Amara stood in the courtyard for a long time by herself. Then she went to find her family. She buried her father and her brother on the hill behind the palace where Orama's kings had always been laid to rest. Her mother beside them. She did it quietly, with a small gathering of the people who had loved them, and when it was over she stood at the graves until the last light faded. Then she went inside and began the work of putting her kingdom back together. The coronation of Queen Amara happened one full moon after the army of Zawari marched back west. Oba Sekiru had left a portion of his force behind, enough to secure the kingdom, while Amara and Kalad built Orama's own army back from what remained. The Zawari soldiers would stay until the kingdom could stand on its own feet again. After that, Orama would stand alone the way it always had, but with the alliance now sealed in marriage and in blood, it would never stand entirely alone again. On the day of the coronation, Zoranu stood at the back of the palace hall the same way he had stood at the back of the marriage ceremony in Zawari. He watched Amara kneel and receive the crown of Orama and rise as its queen. He watched Kalad stand beside her. He watched the hall full of Orama's surviving chiefs and warriors, and people raise their voices together. After the ceremony, when the hall had cleared and only the closest circle remained, Amara found him. She told him she wanted to offer him the highest rank in Orama's military, commander of the royal guard, a position that had never been offered to someone from outside the kingdom before. Zoranu listened to all of it. Then he shook his head. He told her he appreciated what she was offering, but he was not built for rank or command or the particular kind of life that came with a permanent position and a title and authority over other men. He had never wanted power over anything, only the freedom to use what he had in his own way, on his own terms, for whatever needed doing. Amara looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded. She had known him long enough by now to know that pushing further was pointless. She did something else instead. She commissioned it quietly, without telling him, in the 2 weeks between the coronation and the morning he came to say goodbye. On the last day, as Zoranu stood in the palace courtyard with his few belongings prepared to leave, Amara walked him to the entrance of the kingdom. And there, standing at the main gate of Orama, where every person entering or leaving the kingdom would pass beneath it, was a statue. It was large, carved from the dark stone of Orama's eastern quarry, taller than 2 men standing on each other's shoulders. It showed a figure standing straight, not in a battle pose, not holding a weapon, just standing, still and calm and present. The face was his. At the base, carved into the stone in Orama's script, were 3 words: strength, humility, protection. Zoranu stood and looked at it for a long time. He had never seen his own face looked at that way before, had never stood in a place where the ground beneath his feet felt like it was actually his. The people of Orama passing through the gate stopped and looked at him standing beneath his own statue, the man himself in the flesh, and the looks on their faces were nothing like the looks he had grown up with in Okara. No fear, no suspicion, no carefully managed distance, just recognition, gratitude, something that in some faces looked very close to pride. For the first time in his life, Zoranu felt what it was to be somewhere that wanted him there. He stood under that statue for a long time. 2 full moons passed. He stayed longer than he had planned, which surprised him. He rose each morning and moved through Orama without purpose or schedule, helping where help was needed the way he always had. A wall here, a collapsed structure there, whatever the day presented. The people of Orama absorbed his presence the way a dry land absorbs rain, naturally, without making it strange. But the feeling came back eventually, the one that had always come back, the pull of the road, the horizon that sits at the edge of every direction and refuses to stop being interesting. He found Amara in the palace garden on the morning he had decided. She saw it in his face again, the same look he had worn in the Zawari courtyard. This time she didn't kneel. She had already asked him once, and he had given her more than she had the right to ask for. She understood that a man like Zoranu could not be kept anywhere. He could only ever be somewhere by his own choice, for as long as that choice lasted. She stood up from where she was sitting and faced him. She told him that Orama would always be his home, that the gate he had walked out of today he could walk back through any time, in any season, for the rest of his life, and there would always be a place for him in the palace. She told him that what he had done, for her family, for the kingdom, was something Orama would carry in its memory long after both of them were gone. Then she stepped forward and held him. Not the formal embrace of a queen to a subject, the kind of embrace a person gives to someone they are genuinely afraid of never seeing again. When she stepped back, her eyes were full. She didn't try to stop them. Zoranu looked at her for a moment. Then he turned and walked through the gate of Orama, beneath the statue of himself, and out onto the open road heading north. He didn't look back, not from coldness, but because men like Zoranu face forward, always forward, toward whatever the world still had waiting that needed the particular thing only he could give it. The road north stretched ahead of him, long and open and full of everything he didn't know yet. He walked into it. Today the world knows Superman as the greatest symbol of strength in the history of storytelling. A man who fell from the sky with power beyond human understanding, who could not be cut, could not be broken, could not be stopped. A man who used everything he had not to rule or to take, but to protect. A man who was rejected by some and celebrated by others, who never asked for recognition and never needed it to keep going. The world calls it fiction, but the blueprint for that story is older than any comic book. It was drawn in the red dust of ancient Africa, in kingdoms whose names the world forgot when the colonizers rewrote the history. It lived in the bodies of men whose strength was feared by the very people they protected. Men who were cast out not because they were dangerous, but because what they represented was too large for small-minded fear to contain. Zoranu was not the only one. He was one of many. Men in ancient West African legend who carried the kind of strength that defied explanation, who used it without arrogance, who walked away from power when power was offered, who measured their worth not in what they conquered but in what they protected. Zoranu was one of those men, the man of steel of ancient Africa. He was an African man on a dusty road, walking toward whatever needed him next, carrying strength the world had not yet learned to deserve. He just needed someone to finally tell his story. Now you have heard it, and now you know there was a Superman who existed in the ancient African.